At Westwood Village Memorial Park, two graves stand side by side. One belongs to Marilyn Monroe. Since 1962, the other to Hugh Hefner. Since 2017, the distance between them is just a few steps, but their actual connection, it never existed. They never met, never spoke, never stood in the same room. Yet in 1971, Hefner paid $75,000 for the gravesite next to Marilyn. He owned that spot for 46 years. "My career owes her everything," he said. Playboy's first issue featured Marilyn's nude photographs, 1953. She didn't pose for Playboy. Those photos were taken in 1949 for a different photographer, for a different purpose. Hefner purchased the licensing rights, $500. Marilyn had no idea, no consent. Those photos launched Playboy, made Hugh Hefner a millionaire, made Marilyn Monroe forever Playboy's first cover girl, without her permission. So why have we spent decades hearing Hefner was in love with Marilyn? Why does the media keep feeding this relationship? And most importantly, are there really hidden photographs in the Playboy archives? Don't forget to hit subscribe. This story gets much darker than you think. Fall of 1949, Los Angeles, a cold November evening. 23-year-old Norma Jean Baker, who hadn't yet become Marilyn Monroe, knocked on the door of a small studio, Tom Kelly's photography studio. Norma Jean had $50 in her pocket. She couldn't pay her rent. Her car was in danger of repossession. Casting directors weren't calling anymore. There were thousands of beautiful girls in Hollywood, and Norma Jean was just one of them. When Tom Kelly opened the door, he saw the desperation in the young woman's eyes. "Are you willing to pose nude?" he asked. Norma Jean hesitated, just for a second. Then she nodded. $50. Just one night. Nobody would see. Kelly had promised. The photos would only be used in art galleries, anonymous. Her face wouldn't show. Just a body. Just a shadow. Just survival. The photos taken that night would change Hollywood history forever. But in that moment, Norma Jean just took the $50, went home, and never thought about those photos again, for 4 years. Because during those 4 years, Norma Jean Baker disappeared and Marilyn Monroe was born. 20th Century Fox signed her to a 7-year contract. Niagara made her a star. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes made her a superstar. By 1953, Marilyn Monroe was America's most talked-about woman. Everyone wanted her. Everyone knew her. Everyone wanted to say something about her. And that's when Hugh Hefner appeared. Who was Hugh Hefner? In 1953, he was a 27-year-old publisher. In Chicago, in a small apartment, dreaming a big dream, a magazine for men, not just naked women, a sophisticated lifestyle, jazz music, literature, intellectual conversation, and of course beautiful women. But he had no money, no office, no publisher, just an idea. And to sell that idea, he needed a cover girl, a famous cover girl, a shocking cover girl, Marilyn Monroe. When Hefner heard that the negatives from Tom Kelly's 1949 shoot were still for sale, he acted immediately. $500, half his entire capital. But it was worth the risk, because in those photos, Marilyn was completely nude, lying on red velvet fabric, arms raised, eyes closed, her body perfectly illuminated. Was it artistic? Yes. Was it erotic? Absolutely. Would it create a scandal? Hefner bet on it. But there was a problem. Marilyn Monroe hadn't given permission. Hefner didn't care. "These photos are public domain," he told his lawyers. "They're Tom Kelly's property. Legally, I can purchase them." And he did. In December 1953, Playboy magazine's first issue was published. The cover showed Marilyn's face, but she was dressed. Inside, when you opened the centerfold, she was completely nude. 54,000 copies sold. Overnight, Hugh Hefner woke up the next day a millionaire. And Marilyn Monroe, she learned about it from the newspapers. Marilyn's reaction was shocking. She didn't get angry, didn't cry, didn't expect to get fired. Instead, she made a strategic move. She held a press conference, looked reporters directly in the eye and said, "Yes, that's me. I posed in 1949. I couldn't pay my rent. That was my only option. I'm not sorry. I did it to survive. Any woman in the same situation would have done the same thing. America wasn't expecting this. In that era, in conservative 1950s America, such a confession meant career suicide. But Marilyn chose honesty. She wasn't ashamed, didn't apologize, just told the truth, and the public loved her for it. Studios didn't fire her. On the contrary, her popularity increased. Film offers started pouring in. Marilyn Monroe became Hollywood's first modern star. The woman who controlled her own story. At least that's how it appeared. But Hugh Hefner was writing a different story. After Playboy's success, Hefner built an empire. A new issue every month, a new naked woman in each issue, but none became as iconic as Marilyn. Because Marilyn wasn't just a body, she was a phenomenon, a symbol, the combination of sexuality and innocence, the woman men fantasized about and women wanted to be. And Hefner knew this very well. That's why he used Marilyn again and again, in Playboy's anniversary issues, in special editions, in retrospectives, every time using Marilyn's name, every time using her photos, every time saying Playboy's first cover girl, as if Marilyn had posed for Playboy, as if there had been an agreement between them, as if Marilyn was part of his career. But Marilyn never met Hefner. Late 1950s, Marilyn Monroe was at the peak of her career. Some Like It Hot made her legendary. She was working with Billy Wilder, married to Arthur Miller, accepted in intellectual circles, studying method acting at the Actors Studio. She was Lee Strasberg's private student. Marilyn was no longer just a sex symbol. She was a serious actress, a respected artist. But Hugh Hefner still saw her on that red velvet. 1949. Nude. Vulnerable. The girl who posed for $50. Hefner never let go of that image, because that image had given him everything. Wealth, fame, empire, the Playboy mansion. Everything came through Marilyn's body. But there was a paradox. Hefner constantly talked about Marilyn, mentioned her in interviews. My inspiration, he'd say. My muse, he'd say. Playboy couldn't exist without her, he'd say. It was true. But Hefner never tried to meet Marilyn, never wrote a letter, never sent flowers, never thanked her, just watched from afar, just used her photos, just made money off her. Was this admiration or exploitation? Hefner never explicitly said. But when Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, Hefner's reaction explained everything. August 5, 1962. She was 36 years old. Official cause of death. Probable suicide from barbiturate overdose. But those around her said otherwise. It was murder, not an accident. The Kennedy brothers were involved. FBI files had disappeared. Phone records were erased. Marilyn's final hours were mysterious, and still are. More than 60 years have passed. But the truth is still unknown. The public creates theories, conspiracy theories, secret relationships, hidden evidence. But Hugh Hefner's reaction was very simple. In Playboy's September issue, he published a special section, Marilyn, a remembrance. Inside were Marilyn's photos, highlights of her career. And of course those red velvet photos, 1949, defenseless, the girl who posed for $50. Hefner used her again, even after her death. But the real shock came in 1971. Hugh Hefner purchased a gravesite at Westwood Village Memorial Park. Right? No, not just a gravesite, the spot directly next to Marilyn Monroe's grave. Crypt 12, Marilyn was in Crypt 24, only a wall between them. Hefner paid $75,000 for this spot. In 1971, 9 years after Marilyn's death, Playboy was now a massive empire. Hefner was world famous, living in the Playboy mansion. He'd been with hundreds of women, famous actresses, models, singers, all had passed through Hefner's life. But who did he want to be with in death? Marilyn Monroe, the woman he'd never met. Why did Hefner do this? When the press asked, his answer was ready. Marilyn changed my career. I owe her a debt. Being next to her is an honor. Was it romantic, respectful, or disturbing? Marilyn's family made no comment. Marilyn's ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio, had been sending flowers to Marilyn's grave every week for years. But after Hefner's grave purchase, DiMaggio never commented. He silently continued, sent his flowers, mourned. He had loved Marilyn, really loved her. While she was alive, he'd married her, lived with her, touched her, talked to her. Hefner, he'd only used a photograph. For 46 years, Hefner owned that gravesite. Every year, on Playboy anniversaries, Hefner talked about Marilyn. My muse, he'd say. My inspiration, he'd say. The woman who created Playboy, he'd say. And every time, the media repeated this story. Hefner was in love with Marilyn. Hefner never forgot Marilyn. Hefner and Marilyn, an eternal bond. Those were the headlines. But what was the truth? They never met, never spoke, never attended the same event, never appeared in a photo together. Hefner's collection contained thousands of photos of Playboy models, but no photo with Marilyn, because such a moment never existed. A legend has circulated for decades. There are secret photos of Marilyn in the Playboy archives. Hugh Hefner never published them. They were too special, too personal, too scandalous. This story has been repeated so many times that it now appears to be true. It's discussed on internet forums. Conspiracy theorists search for evidence. Some claim Tom Kelly took more photos in 1949. Some say Marilyn secretly posed for Playboy in the 1950s. Some think Hefner kept these photos to protect Marilyn's reputation. But the truth is much simpler and much more disappointing. From Tom Kelly's 1949 shoot, there's only one series of negatives, all catalogued. In UCLA Special Collections archives, all negatives counted, examined, published. There's no hidden frame, no missing photograph. Kelly was a photographer with professional ethics. He documented everything. And in 2010, the Playboy archive was completely digitized. Thousands of pages scanned, hundreds of thousands of photos catalogued. Everything about Marilyn was reviewed. Result? No secret photos found, because they never existed. But why is this legend so powerful? Because Hugh Hefner fed off this mystery. He never made a definitive statement, never said no, there are no other photos. Instead, he remained vague. In interviews, he'd say, "Playboy archives are very extensive. I can't remember everything. Some things should remain private." These answers fueled speculation. The media continued writing stories. The public continued believing. And Hefner, he just smiled. Because mystery was more valuable than truth. Mystery kept Marilyn tied to Playboy. Mystery created the illusion that Hefner had a special connection with Marilyn. But it was an illusion, just an illusion. September 2017, Hugh Hefner died at 91, at the Playboy Mansion. Natural causes. He'd lived a long life, had a successful career, owned millions of dollars, been with hundreds of women, married 3 times, had 4 children, and when he died, his will contained one request: to be buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Crypt 12, next to Marilyn Monroe. His family honored his request. On September 27, 2017, Hugh Hefner was buried next to Marilyn forever. The spot he'd purchased 46 years earlier for $75,000. That day at his funeral, there were celebrities, Playboy models, business partners, family. But Marilyn's family wasn't there because they hadn't been invited. Marilyn's relatives made no comment about Hefner's funeral. Joe DiMaggio had already died in 1999, after living long enough to send flowers to Marilyn's grave every week. But if he'd heard about Hefner's plan, what would he have said? Unknown. Because back then, Hefner hadn't bought the gravesite yet. Today, if you visit Westwood Village Memorial Park, you'll see 2 graves side by side. One is Marilyn Monroe, 1926-2017. A few steps between them. They never met in life, but they're side by side in death. Tourists take photos. Hefner and Marilyn finally together, they say. But this isn't true, because Marilyn never chose to be with Hefner. She didn't choose it while alive. This decision was made 9 years after her death by Hefner. Marilyn wasn't asked. Her family wasn't asked. Only Hefner decided and paid $75,000. Was this a gesture of respect, or was it ownership? Was it a tribute to Marilyn, or an investment in Hefner's own legacy? Hugh Hefner's connection to Marilyn was entirely business. This is harsh but true. In 1953, Hefner bought a photo license for $500. That investment earned him millions. Playboy's first issue sold 54,000 copies. The second issue sold more. The third even more. In every issue, Marilyn's name was mentioned. Playboy's first cover girl. the woman who made Hugh Hefner famous, Playboy and Marilyn. This connection became part of Hefner's brand identity, and Hefner never let go of this connection, because Marilyn sold, still sells. More than 60 years have passed, but Marilyn Monroe is still one of the world's most recognizable faces, still one of the highest-earning deceased celebrities, image rights worth millions, and as long as Hefner was alive, he tied Marilyn to his own story. The 1971 grave purchase was a strategic move. Hefner was 45 at the time, not an age to be thinking about death, but he bought the gravesite. Why? Because it was an investment, a media story. When the press heard about it, they made it big news. Hugh Hefner wants to be buried next to Marilyn. Those were the headlines. Interviews were conducted, discussed on television programs. Hefner said the same thing every time. I owe Marilyn. Being next to her is an honor. And every time, Playboy was mentioned. Every time, the 1953 first issue was recalled. Every time, Hefner's story was told. $75,000 was one of the best marketing investments. But Marilyn's legacy wasn't just Hefner's. Marilyn's image rights were a complex legal matter. When she died in 1962, her will left 75% to acting coach Lee Strasberg, 25% to Dr. Marianne Criss. But neither Strasberg nor Criss sold Marilyn's image to Hefner, because Hefner didn't have anything in hand anyway, just a 1949 photo license, nothing else. All of Marilyn's other photos, films, interviews were controlled by others. 20th Century Fox owned the studio photographs. Getty Images owned the paparazzi photos. Her family owned personal photos. What did Hefner have? Just a story. The story of Playboy's first cover girl. And he repeated this story so many times that it seemed true. Something changed in the early 2000s. The internet age began. Information democratized. Archives digitized. People started researching facts. And the Hefner-Marilyn connection began to be questioned. Academics wrote biographies. Archivists scanned documents. Comprehensive research on Marilyn Monroe was conducted. Donald Spoto's Marilyn Monroe, the biography, was published. Lois Banner's Marilyn, the Passion and the Paradox was published. Elizabeth Fratterigo's academic study Playboy and the Making of the Good Life in Modern America was published. All had a common conclusion. Marilyn Monroe and Hugh Hefner never met. There was no personal connection between them. Hefner's "I owe Marilyn" words were commercial, not emotional. But the media continued to ignore this truth, because the truth wasn't as interesting as the legend. Hefner and Marilyn never met, didn't sell headlines, but Hefner's lifelong love for Marilyn did sell. So tabloids published the same story again and again. Television shows repeated the same theories, documentaries showed the same distortions, and the public continued believing because it was more romantic, more interesting, more like a story. But the truth was cold. It was business. It was exploitation. Hugh Hefner showed no regret in his final years. In 2010, approaching 90, he talked about Marilyn in an interview. The woman who created Playboy, he said, this empire wouldn't exist without her. It was true, but incomplete, because Marilyn didn't create Playboy. Hugh Hefner created it, using photos of Marilyn taken without her consent. Marilyn was just the tool. Hefner was the architect. And Hefner never fully acknowledged this truth, because if he did, his story would collapse. The image of businessman in love with Marilyn would crumble. Only the truth would remain, an entrepreneur who profited from a young woman's desperation. Today, Marilyn Monroe's legacy is a massive industry. About $10 million in revenue annually, product licensing, image rights, retrospectives, auctions, Marilyn's face on T-shirts, posters, Andy Warhol paintings, museum exhibitions. More than 60 years since her death, but Marilyn is still iconic, still inspiring, still controversial. And Hugh Hefner, is he also part of this legacy? Some think so. Hefner made Marilyn immortal, they say. Thanks to Playboy, Marilyn wasn't forgotten, they say. But is this true? The truth is, Marilyn Monroe was immortal independent of Hugh Hefner. Her films made her immortal. Her talent made her immortal. Her complex personality made her immortal. Her tragic death made her immortal. Playboy was just one moment in her career journey. An important moment? Maybe, but not defining. Marilyn's most iconic moments didn't come from Playboy. They came from the white dress scene in The 7-Year Itch, from her comedic genius in Some Like It Hot, from her marriage to Joe DiMaggio, from her intellectual relationship with Arthur Miller, from the rumors about the Kennedy brothers. These moments made Marilyn legendary. Hefner just used a photograph, but in Hefner's legacy, Marilyn is a central figure. Almost every room in the Playboy mansion had a photo of Marilyn. A giant Marilyn poster hung in Hefner's office. Playboy anniversary issues always had special sections about Marilyn. Hefner constantly talked about Marilyn in interviews. He placed Marilyn at the center of his success story, and when he died, he was buried next to Marilyn. Was this admiration, respect, or a marketing strategy that lasted forever? The answer was perhaps a mixture of all, but it was certainly predominantly business. At Westwood Village Memorial Park, Marilyn's grave is still one of the most visited graves. Dozens of people come every day, leave flowers, take photos, leave lipstick kisses. Marilyn's gravestone is covered with lipstick. Fans press their lips against it. This has become a tradition, a show of love, a show of respect. But right next to it, Hugh Hefner's grave stands almost empty. Very few people stop. Very few flowers are left, because people come to see Marilyn, not Hefner. This is ironic, because Hefner owned that spot for 46 years, paid $75,000, but even in death, Marilyn overshadows him. This is perhaps the greatest truth. Hugh Hefner could never own Marilyn Monroe. He only bought a photo license, bought a gravesite, but he could never control Marilyn's spirit, her legacy, her iconization. Marilyn's greatness was independent of Hefner. It existed before Playboy, continued after Playboy, and will continue forever. Because Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a star, she was a phenomenon, a symbol, proof that women could be powerful, a demonstration of the power of vulnerability, an embodiment of tragic beauty. And all of this was beyond Hefner's control. When the Me Too movement began in the 2010s, Hefner's legacy began to be questioned. Playboy philosophy was criticized, accused of sexually objectifying women. Hefner's lifestyle at the Playboy mansion was debated. Former Playboy models told harassment stories. Hefner's image cracked. The sexual revolution pioneer image faced female exploiter criticisms. And in this context, his relationship with Marilyn was re-evaluated. Did Hefner use Marilyn's photos without permission? Yes. Did he ever apologize to Marilyn? No. Did he give Marilyn a share from this use? No. So was this exploitation? Many feminist critics said yes. Truth is always complex. Was Hugh Hefner a bad person? Debatable. Was he a visionary entrepreneur? Absolutely. Did he exploit women? In some contexts, yes. Did he create a cultural revolution? Unquestionably. But his relationship with Marilyn Monroe? This is simpler, because there was no relationship. Never was. There was only a business transaction. $500 in 1953. A photo license. And this transaction gave Hefner everything. But what did it give Marilyn? Another scandal. Another controversy. Another pain. When Marilyn died in 1962, the Playboy photos still bothered her. Friends mentioned this. Marilyn had said, "I want those photos to stay in my past." But they didn't stay in the past. Hugh Hefner kept them alive, on every anniversary, in every retrospective, in every interview. Marilyn tried to escape, took serious roles, went to the actor's studio, joined intellectual circles, but the Playboy photos followed her, and Hefner never let go, because those photos were his fortune. Marilyn's past was Hefner's future. The 1971 grave purchase locked this dynamic in forever. Hefner said, "I owe Marilyn," but he never paid the debt, never thanked her while Marilyn was alive, never asked permission, never gave her a share, just used. And after she died, he chose to be buried next to her. Marilyn's family didn't object, because legally they couldn't object. The gravesite was Hefner's. He'd purchased it, but morally, that's another question. Would Marilyn have chosen to be next to Hefner? We'll never know. But those who knew Marilyn say no. Joe DiMaggio would have said no. Arthur Miller would have said no. Marilyn's psychiatrist would have said no, because Marilyn didn't know Hefner, and if she had known him, she probably wouldn't have liked him. Today, the younger generation sees Marilyn Monroe differently, no longer just a sex symbol, an early pioneer of feminism, an intelligent strategist, a woman fighting against the system, Hollywood's victim but also survivor. Marilyn's story is being retold, deeper, more empathetic, more accurate. And in this new narrative, Hugh Hefner's place is shrinking, because Hefner wasn't an important part of Marilyn's story, just a footnote, just an appendix page, just someone who used Marilyn's image without permission and made a fortune from it. Playboy itself has changed. In 2020, the Playboy mansion was sold. New owners restored the house. The Hefner era ended. Playboy magazine no longer publishes in print, only digital. And the content has changed. No longer just naked women. Interviews, articles, cultural commentary. Playboy has become a nostalgia object, a symbol of an era. But Marilyn Monroe, she's still timeless, still modern, still relevant, because Marilyn was a human story, a struggle story, a survival story. Hefner was just a business story. So what does it mean that he remains forever next to her grave? For some, it's romantic. They came together in death. But the truth is darker, because Marilyn had no choice. Hefner made the choice for $75,000, and Marilyn lies silently beside him. Can't protest, can't say no, just there, once again, out of control, once again defined by someone else's decision. This is a tragic metaphor for Marilyn's life. She had beauty, talent, intelligence, but control was rarely hers. Studios controlled, men controlled, media controlled, and finally, even in death, Hugh Hefner made a decision. Marilyn Monroe's story is shaped by how we tell it. Do we remember her as a victim, as a sex symbol, as an intelligent strategist, as a tragic figure? The answer is a bit of everything, because Marilyn was complex, full of contradictions, both strong and fragile, both famous and lonely, both intelligent and exploited. And her relationship with Hugh Hefner? This also depends on how it's told. Will Hefner be told as the man in love with Marilyn, or as the businessman who used Marilyn's image without consent? The truth is, both narratives are incomplete, because there was no love, but there was no hate either. There was only a business relationship, one-sided, asymmetric. Hefner used. Marilyn was unaware. Then Marilyn learned. Then Marilyn tried to turn the situation in her favor, told the press honestly, didn't apologize, survived, and her career continued. But Hefner never let go, because Marilyn was his fortune, and you never abandon your fortune, even in death. At Westwood Village Memorial Park, those two graves will continue standing side by side. Tourists will continue coming to take photos. Media will continue telling stories. Hefner and Marilyn, as if they were a couple, as if it were a love story. But it's not, never was. It was just one man's decision to tie another person's image to himself forever, for $75,000. And Marilyn, lying silently, with her world-changing smile, with her tragic story, and with a legacy she couldn't control. Because the truth is, Marilyn Monroe was much bigger than Hugh Hefner, much bigger than Playboy, much bigger than a single photograph. Marilyn was a legend, and legends can never belong to anyone. They belong to memory, and memory is selective. History will remember Marilyn. Hugh Hefner, perhaps only as a footnote. In the end, the truth is this: two people lying side by side, one a legend, the other in the legend's shadow, one iconic, the other controversial. One will be remembered forever, the other will slowly be forgotten, because we don't need Hugh Hefner to remember Marilyn Monroe. But to remember Hugh Hefner, we always needed Marilyn Monroe. That was the real dark bond of this story.